The broadcast media, which includes television and radio, displaced print media. The first thing to challenge the dominance of newspapers was radio. Radio was invented in 1903, but there weren't commercial radio stations you could just listen to at your home until 1920. Pittsburgh's KDKA was the first broadcast network in American history, and its first broadcast was the 1920 election where Harding beat Cox. Television is actually almost as old as radio, but there weren't television stations until 1931. In the 1950s and 60s, we finally get to a point where pretty much everybody has a television in their home, and it becomes the dominant media form, certainly by 1960, when we see the very first presidential debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And this debate really brought home the power of television because if you've ever seen a picture of Kennedy and a picture of Nixon, you probably know why. But Kennedy, who was very, very presentable, very nice-looking man, came across great on TV. In an election that was decided by a few thousand votes, many people give Kennedy's ability to look good on TV as opposed to Nixon, who had a 5 o'clock shadow and was kind of sweaty and refused to wear makeup. Many people explain Kennedy's narrow victory in 1960 through this debate. It brought government and politics into people's homes, not only presidential debates, but things like the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, in many ways, was shocking because people saw the casualties on TV. You would go home and sit down to have dinner, and back then it was very common for families to sit down and turn the TV on and eat their dinner, and they would see dead American soldiers. They would see the Tet Offensive in 1969 as the cities in Vietnam are being overrun by the Viet Cong. Even though we won the Tet Offensive, if you watched it on the news, it looked terrible, and people began to get the idea that we were actually losing the Vietnam War. Oh, there it is about the Kennedy-Nixon debate. The Civil Rights Movement, I should also add, was critically dependent upon TV. Martin Luther King understood, before most people did, that everybody was watching TV, and TV had a profound effect on the way we saw things. And so he figured out that if you get images of people being beaten savagely on TV, then that was going to severely impact the public opinion. And so his opponents didn't seem to quite get this, but he did. And so one of the reasons for the success of the Civil Rights Movement was the really unexcusable violence directed at like women and children, particularly in Selma, Alabama, when Bull Connor unleashed the dogs and fire hoses. People sat in their living rooms and watched that, and it really affected it really created a lot of sympathy for African Americans in their struggle for equality. Broadcast media is regulated by the government. The idea is that the airwaves are owned by the government, and they are essentially loaned to or licensed out to these companies, and that means that the government can decide what goes on them. The Federal Communications Commission regulates the use of the airwaves in 3 ways. They prevent monopoly control of markets, which is why one company doesn't own all the TV or radio stations in your town. There's some variety. They review the performance of stations to make sure that they're not broadcasting things that the FCC doesn't approve of, like, for example, nudity or sex during the day or foul language. And they also regulate fair treatment for politicians. A radio station can't say, I don't like that politician, so I won't run any of his ads. All politicians have to be given equal access to the airwaves, or the government will shut the station down. Cable, of course, has changed everything. Back when I was a kid, there were only 3 TV networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. And so you didn't have a lot of variety. Nowadays, of course, with cable, you have hundreds and hundreds of networks. And if you get on the internet, you have much more variety in what you can watch. Of course, DVRs now allow you to watch things at different times. So what that has allowed, back in the day, programming had to appeal to a broad section of people because they were trying to get a third or more of the. Back in the day, they were trying to appeal. The networks were trying to appeal to a very broad section of people because they were trying to get a third or more of the TV audience because there were only 3 channels. But as cable has come along and more options for what you can watch exist, they've quit going for this broad, sweeping, get 100 million viewers type programming, and now they do what's called narrowcasting, where they're more than happy to get maybe 100,000 viewers. If you get 300,000 viewers, by the way, you're doing great in this day and age. And so now you have lots of shows that are much more specialized on one particular audience, which maybe explains some of the programming you see when you turn on your TV.